The dust hung thick in the afternoon air of Nebraska City, Nebraska, when Delilah Anne first walked into the mercantile store, and the shopkeeper asked her 3 times what she needed before she could form the words that moved so slowly from her mind to her tongue. Warren Nichols stood by the counter buying rope and ammunition that September day in 1875, watching the scene unfold with quiet attention while others snickered behind their hands at the young woman who spoke as though each word needed careful consideration before it could escape into the world. Delilah's words came out measured and deliberate, her thoughts clearly taking their time to transform into speech, and the shopkeeper grew impatient as he tapped his fingers on the worn wooden counter. She wanted flour and sugar and thread, but the words emerged slowly, pausing between each item as if she had to reach deep into a well to draw them up. The other customers exchanged glances that spoke volumes about what they thought of her, their judgment hanging in the air like the dust motes, dancing in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Warren watched her carefully, noticing how her eyes were clear and intelligent despite her halting speech, how her hands moved with precision as she counted out the exact coins needed for her purchases, how she organized her basket with deliberate efficiency. When she finally completed her transaction and turned to leave, he noticed the way her shoulders curved inward slightly, as though she was trying to make herself smaller in the face of the town's judgment. The next time Warren saw Delilah was at the town well 3 days later. A group of women stood clustered nearby, their conversation stopping abruptly when Delilah approached with her wooden bucket. Warren was watering his horse after a long morning checking fence lines on the ranch where he worked, and he observed the way the women watched Delilah with poorly concealed amusement. One of them, a sharp-featured woman named Mrs. Henderson, called out to Delilah with false sweetness dripping from her voice. She asked if Delilah needed help understanding how the well worked, speaking slowly and loudly as if Delilah were deaf or a small child rather than a woman of 22 years. The other women tittered behind their gloved hands, their laughter cutting through the morning air like knives. Delilah's face flushed red, but she said nothing in response, simply lowered her bucket into the well with steady hands and drew up the water she needed. Warren found himself stepping forward before he fully realized what he was doing, tipping his hat politely to Delilah and commenting on what a fine, clear morning it was for drawing water. His intervention disrupted the women's cruel entertainment, and they dispersed with disappointed expressions, their opportunity for mockery stolen. Delilah looked up at Warren with surprise in her wide brown eyes, and slowly, carefully, she thanked him. The words took time to emerge, but when they did, Warren heard the genuine gratitude in them. He introduced himself properly, taking off his hat and holding it respectfully in his hands. She told him her name in return, each syllable measured and precise, and Warren noticed how musical her voice was when people actually gave her the time to speak. Warren asked if he could help carry her water bucket back to wherever she was staying, and Delilah considered the offer for a long moment before nodding acceptance. They walked together through the dusty streets of Nebraska City, past the saloon where piano music already jangled despite the early hour, past the bank with its painted sign, past the general store where more people stood watching them with curious expressions. Delilah lived in a small house at the edge of town with her elderly aunt, Martha Ann, who had taken her in after Delilah's parents died of fever 3 years earlier. The house was neat and well-maintained, with flowers growing in carefully tended beds along the front path and lace curtains visible through the spotless windows. Warren set the water bucket down by the front steps and found himself reluctant to leave. He asked Delilah if she thought the weather would hold for harvest, a simple question about practical matters, and watched as she took her time considering her response. When she finally spoke, she told him that she had been watching the birds gathering in larger flocks each morning, and the way the leaves on the cottonwoods were starting to curl at the edges despite still being green, and she believed an early frost was coming within the month. Her observation was detailed and based on careful attention to the natural world around her, and Warren realized with sudden clarity that her slow speech had nothing to do with slow thinking. Over the following weeks, Warren found reasons to be in town more often than his work strictly required. He would time his visits to coincide with when Delilah might be at the mercantile, or the well, or walking to the church, for the Ladies' Charitable Society meetings that she attended despite the cool reception she received there. Each time they spoke, Warren made sure to give her all the time she needed to form her words, never rushing her or finishing her sentences the way so many others did. Delilah began to relax around him, her shoulders no longer hunching defensively when he approached. She would smile when she saw him, a slow-spreading warmth that transformed her entire face, and Warren felt his heart beat faster each time he witnessed that transformation. Her observations about the world around them continued to impress him with their depth and insight. She noticed things others missed because she took the time to truly see and consider before speaking. One afternoon in early October, Warren invited Delilah to walk with him along the banks of the Missouri River that ran near the town. The cottonwoods were turning golden, their leaves rustling in the breeze that carried the scent of approaching autumn. Delilah accepted his invitation after taking her usual time to consider, and they walked together in comfortable silence for a while before she began to speak. She told him about her childhood on a farm further north, how she had always been this way with words moving slowly from thought to speech, how other children had teased her mercilessly in school until she had stopped attending altogether at age 14. Her parents had understood her and never made her feel lacking, but after they died, the world became a much harsher place. Her Aunt Martha was kind but elderly and largely deaf, so Delilah spent most of her time in silence, keeping her thoughts to herself rather than subjecting herself to the judgment and impatience of others. Warren listened to every word, watching how the afternoon light caught in her dark hair and illuminated the intelligence in her eyes. He told her about his own life, how he had come west from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier after his older brother inherited the family farm, leaving Warren with nothing but his horse and his determination to make his own way. He had worked various ranch jobs across Nebraska, saving his money carefully, dreaming of the day he could purchase his own land and build something permanent. The question Delilah asked him next came slowly, but struck directly at the heart of things. She wanted to know why he was kind to her when the rest of the town treated her as though she were simple-minded. Warren stopped walking and turned to face her directly, his blue eyes serious and honest as he told her the truth. He said that anyone who actually listened to her would hear the wisdom in her words, would recognize the careful consideration and deep thought behind her observations, would understand that slow speech and slow thinking were not the same thing at all. Delilah's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back quickly, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. She told him that no one besides her parents had ever truly listened to her before, had ever waited patiently for her words instead of dismissing her or speaking over her or treating her like a child. Warren reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wished, and took her hand in his. Her fingers were work-roughened and capable, and they trembled slightly in his grasp. They stood together by the river as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Warren knew in that moment that he was falling in love with this woman, who the town dismissed, but who saw the world with such clarity and depth. He did not speak these feelings aloud yet, knowing that such declarations required the right time and place, but he held her hand gently and felt the connection growing between them like roots sinking deep into fertile soil. The relationship between Warren and Delilah became the subject of much gossip in Nebraska City over the following weeks. The ranch hands Warren worked with teased him about courting the slow girl, their jokes ranging from merely thoughtless to genuinely cruel. Warren bore their comments with gritted teeth, until one evening when a cowboy named Jake pushed too far, making an especially crude remark about Delilah's intelligence while they sat around the bunkhouse after dinner. Warren stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His voice was deadly quiet as he told Jake to take back his words and apologize. Jake laughed and asked what Warren would do if he refused, and Warren showed him with a right cross that split Jake's lip and sent him sprawling backward onto his bunk. The fight was brief and decisive, and when it ended, Warren made it crystal clear that he would not tolerate disrespect toward Delilah from anyone. The other ranch hands gave Warren more space after that incident, their jokes ceasing entirely, though the looks they exchanged behind his back suggested they still thought him foolish for pursuing a woman they considered defective. Warren did not care about their opinions. He cared about the way Delilah's face lit up when she saw him, the way she was gradually becoming more comfortable sharing her thoughts and observations with him, the way her slow, careful words revealed a mind that was anything but simple. November arrived with cold winds that stripped the last leaves from the trees and sent them skittering down the dusty streets of Nebraska City. Warren began seriously considering his future and how Delilah might fit into it. He had been saving his wages for years, living frugally and spending little, and he now had enough money to make a down payment on a piece of land he had been eyeing for months. It was a quarter section about 5 miles north of town, with good grass for cattle and a creek that ran year-round providing reliable water. The question that occupied Warren's thoughts during the long, cold days of early winter was whether Delilah would be willing to share that future with him. He knew he loved her, knew it with a certainty that went bone deep, but he worried about asking her to take on the hard life of a rancher's wife. The work would be difficult, and the isolation significant, but perhaps someone who had never been fully accepted by town society might prefer the solitude of ranch life. Warren decided to speak with Delilah's Aunt Martha before proposing, a matter of respect and propriety that his upbringing demanded. He visited their small house on a gray December afternoon, his hat in his hands and his heart hammering against his ribs. Aunt Martha was a tiny woman with white hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing despite her poor hearing. She invited Warren inside and served him coffee in her neat front parlor, then sat across from him waiting for him to state his business. Warren had to speak loudly because of her deafness, which felt awkward when discussing such personal matters, but he pressed forward. He told Aunt Martha that he had deep feelings for her niece, that he believed Delilah was one of the wisest and most observant people he had ever met, and that he wished to ask for her hand in marriage if Aunt Martha would give her blessing. He explained his financial situation honestly, describing the land he intended to purchase and the ranch he planned to build, acknowledging that the life would be hard but promising to work tirelessly to provide for Delilah and treat her with the respect and patience she deserved. Aunt Martha studied him with those sharp eyes for a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then slowly, deliberately, She smiled. She told Warren that she had been praying for years that someone would see past Delilah's slow speech to the remarkable person beneath. She said that Delilah had been so happy these past months since meeting Warren, more animated and alive than Aunt Martha had seen her since before her parents died. The blessing was given freely, along with Aunt Martha's fervent hope that Warren would indeed prove to be the good man he appeared. Warren left the house with relief flooding through him and began planning how he would propose. He wanted it to be special and meaningful, something that Delilah would remember for the rest of her life. He decided to wait until Christmas, which was only 2 weeks away, and began making preparations. On Christmas Eve, Warren borrowed a wagon from the ranch and drove into town to collect Delilah. Snow had fallen the night before, dusting Nebraska City in white and making everything look clean and new in the winter sunshine. Delilah emerged from her house wearing a dark blue dress and a thick wool coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. Warren helped her into the wagon and tucked a heavy blanket around her legs before climbing up beside her and taking the reins. He drove them north out of town, following the frozen road toward the land he intended to purchase. Delilah did not ask where they were going, simply sat beside him in companionable silence as the horse pulled the wagon steadily through the snow. The countryside stretched out white and pristine around them, interrupted only by the dark lines of bare trees and the occasional fence post marking property boundaries. When they reached the quarter section Warren had been saving for, he pulled the wagon to a stop at the highest point of the property. From here, they could see for miles in every direction. The rolling Nebraska prairie spread out like a blank canvas waiting to be marked with the evidence of human dreams and labor. Warren climbed down and came around to help Delilah descend, then led her to a spot where the view was particularly fine. He began to speak, telling her about his vision for this land. He described where he would build the house, positioning it to catch the morning sun while being protected from the harsh north winds by a grove of trees he would plant. He talked about starting with a small herd of cattle and gradually building it up, about putting in a vegetable garden and perhaps some chickens, about creating something permanent and good that would last beyond their own lifetimes. Then Warren turned to face Delilah directly, taking both her hands in his. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear the blood rushing in his ears, but he forced himself to speak clearly and honestly. He told her that he loved her, that he had loved her since those early days when he first realized that her slow speech concealed a quick and penetrating mind. He said that she saw the world with wisdom and clarity that others missed in their rush to judgment, that her observations and insights had taught him to pay better attention to the details around him, that she made him want to be a better man. Warren released one of her hands to reach into his coat pocket and withdrew a simple gold ring that had belonged to his grandmother. He had written to his mother requesting it be sent, and it had arrived just 3 days earlier, delivered to the ranch in a small package wrapped in brown paper. The ring was plain but well made, the gold worn smooth from years of wear. Warren held it up in the cold winter sunlight and asked Delilah if she would do him the honor of becoming his wife. Delilah looked at him with tears streaming down her face, the cold wind carrying them away as quickly as they fell. She took her time forming her answer, as she always did, and Warren waited patiently while his heart felt like it might burst from his chest. When she finally spoke, she said yes. The word was clear and strong despite how slowly it emerged, and Warren felt joy explode through him like fireworks on Independence Day. He slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and then he pulled her close and kissed her for the first time. Her lips were cold from the winter air but warmed quickly beneath his, and when they finally broke apart, Both were breathless and smiling. They stood together on that windswept hilltop, holding each other close against the cold, and Warren felt like the richest man in all of Nebraska, despite having only his wages and this not yet purchased land to his name. The wedding took place in late January at the small church in Nebraska City. It was a simple ceremony attended by Aunt Martha, a few of Warren's friends from the ranch, and several members of the church congregation who came more out of curiosity than genuine goodwill. Delilah wore a cream-colored dress that Aunt Martha had helped her sew, and she carried a small bouquet of dried flowers since nothing fresh was available in the depths of winter. The ceremony itself was brief, and Delilah spoke her vows slowly but clearly, each word weighted with meaning and sincerity. Warren's voice was strong and steady as he made his own promises to love and cherish her for the rest of his days. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Warren kissed his bride tenderly while the small gathering applauded politely. The reception was held at Aunt Martha's house, where she had prepared a wedding supper despite her advanced age and limited resources. The food was simple but plentiful, and Warren made sure to thank her profusely for her efforts and her blessing. As the evening wore on, and the guests gradually departed, Warren and Delilah found themselves alone together in the small room that had been prepared for them, the beginning of their life together stretching out before them, full of possibility and promise. The winter months that followed were a time of transition and adjustment. Warren continued working at the ranch while completing the purchase of his land, the legal proceedings and financial transactions taking several weeks to finalize. During this time, he and Delilah lived in a rented room above the mercantile store, cramped quarters that nevertheless felt like a palace because they were together. Delilah proved to be an excellent manager of their limited resources. She budgeted their money carefully, finding ways to stretch Warren's wages to cover their expenses while still setting aside small amounts toward their future. She sewed and mended their clothes, cooked simple but nourishing meals, and maintained their small space with meticulous care. Warren came home each evening to find everything in order and his wife waiting with a smile that made even the hardest days worthwhile. In the evenings, they would sit together by lamplight and plan their future ranch. Delilah's observations and suggestions proved invaluable. She had grown up on a farm and understood the rhythms of agricultural life, the importance of timing and attention to detail, the need to work with nature rather than against it. Her slow, careful speech became a beloved feature of these planning sessions, her words chosen with precision, and carrying weight that Warren had learned to deeply respect. By March, the land purchase was complete, and Warren owned his quarter section free and clear. He immediately gave notice at the ranch where he had been working, and began the enormous task of building their home and establishing their operation. Several of the ranch hands offered to help with the house raising, including Jake, who had become somewhat friendlier toward Warren after their altercation months earlier, perhaps recognizing that Warren's commitment to Delilah was unshakable. The house they built was modest but solid, a single-story structure with 2 main rooms and a loft space above. The walls were thick sod blocks cut from the prairie itself, plastered inside with clay and whitewash to brighten the interior. The roof was wooden shingles that Warren purchased in town and hauled out in multiple wagon loads. Windows were a significant expense, but Warren insisted on having several to let in light and air, remembering how Delilah loved the sunshine. Delilah worked alongside Warren throughout the construction, her hands growing blistered and rough from the unaccustomed labor. She never complained, instead offering quiet observations about placement and design that invariably proved correct. when she suggested shifting the front door to face east rather than south. Warren initially questioned the wisdom since southern exposure would provide more warmth. But Delilah explained slowly and carefully that the prevailing winds in summer came from the south and would blow directly into a south-facing door, filling the house with dust, whereas an east-facing door would catch the gentle morning breezes while being protected from the harsh afternoon heat. Warren made the change and later found her reasoning absolutely sound. By May, the house was complete enough to move into, though finishing touches would continue for months. They moved their few possessions from town in a single wagon load, and Delilah stood in the doorway of their new home with tears in her eyes. Warren swept her up in his arms and carried her across the threshold, both of them laughing with joy and relief that this moment had finally arrived. Life on the ranch was hard work from dawn until well past dusk. Warren spent his days building fences, digging out the creek bed to create a reliable watering hole, and constructing a barn to shelter the livestock they would soon acquire. Delilah established a vegetable garden near the house, turning the prairie sod and mixing in precious fertilizer to create rich soil. She also took charge of acquiring chickens, purchasing a dozen hens and a rooster from a farmer near town, and building them a secure coop to protect them from coyotes and foxes. The first real test of their partnership came in June when Warren used the last of their savings to purchase 10 head of cattle from a rancher selling off part of his herd. The cattle were young and healthy but entirely unaccustomed to their new home, and they immediately attempted to wander off in search of familiar territory. Warren spent 3 exhausting days rounding them up repeatedly and driving them back to the quarter section, barely sleeping as he tried to establish their boundaries. On the 3rd day, when Warren was near collapse from exhaustion, Delilah came out to where he sat slumped in his saddle watching the cattle mill around the watering hole. She had brought him food and water, but more importantly, she had an observation to share. She told him slowly and thoughtfully that she had been watching the cattle, and she noticed they always moved in the same direction when they tried to leave. They consistently headed northwest, toward where the rancher's property lay. Delilah suggested that, instead of trying to prevent them from going that direction, Warren should redirect their impulse by creating an appealing alternative. She had observed that the best grass on their quarter section grew in the southeast corner near where the creek widened into a small marshy area. If Warren could drive the cattle there and keep them there for several days while they grazed that excellent forage, they might begin to associate their new home with good food and water, rather than viewing it as a prison to escape. Warren followed her advice, and within a week, the cattle had settled into their new home. They still occasionally wandered, but their attempts to return to their former range ceased entirely. Warren was impressed once again by Delilah's careful observation and practical wisdom, and he made sure to tell her so. Her slow smile in response was worth more than all the gold in California. The summer of 1876 was hot and dry, and the garden struggled despite Delilah's best efforts. She watered it daily from the creek, carrying bucket after bucket in the blazing heat, but the harsh sun scorched many of the plants before they could produce. The cattle grew lean as the grass turned brown and brittle, and Warren worried constantly about whether they would make it through until fall rains came. It was during this difficult season that Delilah's worth became most apparent. While Warren tended to respond to problems with immediate action and sometimes frantic effort, Delilah approached challenges with measured consideration. When the garden began to fail, she carefully evaluated which plants might be saved and which were beyond help, then focused their limited water on the most promising specimens. Her triage approach saved enough vegetables to see them through the winter, whereas Warren's instinct would have been to try saving everything and likely losing it all. Similarly, with the cattle, Delilah observed that they spent the hottest part of each day standing in the creek, and she suggested creating a more permanent shelter there by constructing a simple roof structure over part of the water. Warren initially dismissed this as unnecessary, but when two of the cattle showed signs of heat stress, he reconsidered and built the shelter. The cattle immediately took advantage of it, and their condition improved noticeably. By late August, Warren had learned to always listen carefully when Delilah had an observation to share, no matter how long it took her to articulate it. Her slow speech no longer felt like a hindrance, but rather like a guarantee that her words had been thoroughly considered and were worth hearing. They developed a rhythm of partnership where Warren's quick action complemented Delilah's careful consideration, each balancing the other's tendencies toward their strengths. The fall brought relief in the form of rain and cooler temperatures. The grass greened up again, and the cattle put on weight rapidly as they grazed the renewed prairie. Warren and Delilah worked together to prepare for winter, cutting and stacking hay, repairing the barn roof, and ensuring adequate firewood was split and stored. Delilah preserved what vegetables they had managed to grow, putting up jars of pickles and tomatoes and beans that would add variety to their winter diet. In October, Delilah told Warren that she was pregnant. The words came out even more slowly than usual, weighted with emotion and uncertainty about his reaction. Warren responded by sweeping her up in his arms and spinning her around while shouting with joy, his happiness completely unrestrained. When he finally set her down, he was laughing and crying at the same time, overcome with love for his wife and excitement about the child they would welcome together. The pregnancy proceeded normally through the winter months, though Delilah suffered from nausea in the early stages and fatigue that left her exhausted by early evening. Warren took on as much of her usual work as he could manage, milking their cow and tending the chickens before dawn, then cooking their breakfast and helping with household tasks before heading out to his own labor. He had never worked harder in his life, but he had never been happier either. Aunt Martha came to stay with them in April as Delilah's time approached. The elderly woman was frail but determined to help her niece through the birth, and she brought with her practical knowledge accumulated over decades of frontier life. She and Warren worked together to prepare everything needed for the delivery, boiling and storing clean water, assembling cloths and blankets, ensuring the midwife from town knew where the ranch was located and could find it if needed. The baby came on a warm May evening in 1877, 2 years almost to the day after Warren and Delilah had moved into their sod house. The labor was long and difficult, lasting from early morning until sunset, and Warren paced outside the house for most of that time, afraid and helpless while the women worked inside. When he finally heard the thin wail of a newborn, he rushed to the door, only to be blocked by Aunt Martha telling him firmly to wait just a few more minutes while they got mother and child cleaned up and settled. When Warren was finally allowed inside, he found Delilah propped up in their bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face and slowly, carefully told him that they had a son. Warren approached on shaking legs and looked down at the impossibly small face of his child, feeling his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. The baby had a dusting of dark hair and tiny perfect features, his eyes squeezed shut, and his mouth moving in small sucking motions. They named him Thomas Warren Nichols, after Warren's father and Warren himself, and from the moment of his birth, He became the center of their universe. Delilah proved to be a patient and attentive mother, her natural tendency towards slow, careful consideration serving her well in caring for an infant. She never became flustered when Thomas cried, instead methodically checking what he needed and addressing each possibility until she found the right one. Warren learned from watching her, developing his own patience and attention to detail when it came to their son. The ranch continued to grow and prosper over the next several years. Warren gradually increased their cattle herd, selling off yearlings each fall and keeping the best heifers to expand their breeding stock. The garden became more established and productive as Delilah learned which crops did best in their particular soil and microclimate. They added 2 more rooms to the house, expanding it to accommodate their growing family and improving their living conditions. In the fall of 1879, Delilah gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Grace Martha Nichols after the Grace they felt blessed by and Delilah's beloved aunt. Martha Anne had passed away peacefully in her sleep the previous winter, and they both felt her loss keenly. Naming their daughter after her seemed a fitting tribute to the woman who had cared for Delilah when she had no one else, and who had given her blessing to their marriage. Thomas was a bright and energetic toddler by this time, already showing signs that he had inherited his mother's observant nature and his father's energetic approach to life. He followed Warren around the ranch as much as Delilah would allow, imitating his father's work with a toy hammer and a stick he pretended was a rope. He also displayed no impatience whatsoever with his mother's slow speech, simply waiting attentively when she spoke to him and listening carefully to her words. The town of Nebraska City had gradually changed its opinion about Delilah over the years since her marriage to Warren. Part of this shift came from simple familiarity as people grew accustomed to her speech patterns, but much of it resulted from Warren's consistent defense of her and his obvious respect for her intelligence. When he spoke in town about ranch matters, he frequently referenced his wife's observations and recommendations, making it clear that he valued her input and found it reliably sound. There was one particular incident in the spring of 1880 that significantly altered how the town viewed Delilah. A farmer named Peterson came to Warren asking for advice about his cattle, which had been dying mysteriously over the past several weeks. Warren rode out to look at Peterson's operation and brought Delilah with him, as he often did when making decisions that would affect their own ranch. She spent a long time walking Peterson's property, examining the land and the cattle and the water sources, before slowly beginning to share her observations. Delilah pointed out that all of Peterson's dead cattle had been found in or near a particular pasture, and that pasture contained several oleander bushes that were toxic to livestock. Peterson had planted them years earlier near his house for decoration, not realizing they posed a danger, and recent storms had washed seeds from those bushes into the pasture where they had sprouted. The cattle had been nibbling on the young oleander plants, which were especially poisonous, and dying as a result. Peterson was skeptical at first, but Warren urged him to remove the oleander plants and see if the death stopped. Within weeks, the mystery was solved as Peterson's cattle ceased dying and began to recover their health. Peterson spread word through the community about how Delilah's careful observation had saved his herd, and suddenly, people began seeking her opinion on various agricultural matters. She remained soft-spoken and slow in her responses, but now people waited patiently for her words, recognizing that when she finally spoke, she usually offered insights worth hearing. Life fell into a comfortable rhythm over the following years. The ranch continued to prosper, and Warren's reputation as a reliable stockman grew throughout the region. Delilah became known as someone whose judgment could be trusted on matters ranging from animal husbandry to weather prediction to medicinal herbs. Their children grew healthy and strong, Thomas becoming a capable ranch hand despite his young age and Grace showing signs of inheriting her mother's patient observation of the world. In 1882, they welcomed their third child, another son they named Daniel James Nichols. By this time, the ranch was well established and producing steady income, allowing them to hire occasional help during busy seasons. Warren no longer had to work quite so desperately hard, and he found time to simply enjoy his family and the life they had built together. He and Delilah would sit on their porch in the evenings after the children were in bed, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and purple, and Warren would reflect on how fortunate he was. The prosperity they enjoyed was not merely financial, though they were comfortable by frontier standards. More importantly, they had built a partnership based on genuine respect and deep love. Warren never tired of listening to Delilah's slow, careful observations, and Delilah never stopped being grateful for a husband who gave her the time and space to express herself fully. They balanced each other perfectly, his quick energy tempered by her measured consideration, her occasional self-doubt countered by his unwavering confidence in her abilities. Their physical relationship had deepened and matured over the years as well. Where initially there had been hesitation and uncertainty as they learned each other's bodies and preferences, now there was comfortable intimacy and genuine passion. Warren loved the way Delilah's careful nature extended to how she touched him, every caress deliberate and meaningful. Delilah loved how Warren's enthusiasm translated to physical affection, his desire for her never dimming even after years of marriage. In the summer of 1885, a significant challenge arrived in the form of a drought even worse than the one they had experienced in their first year on the ranch. The rain simply stopped falling in May and did not resume through June, July, or August. The grass turned brown and crunchy, the creek that usually ran year-round began to dry up, and the cattle grew thin and desperate for forage. Many ranchers in the area began selling off their herds at significant losses, unable to sustain them through the dry spell. Warren wanted to follow suit, to sell their cattle before they lost too much weight and became nearly worthless, but Delilah asked him to wait. She spent days walking their property, examining the land with her careful eye, and thinking through their options. Finally, she came to Warren with a proposal that had taken her considerable time to formulate, but which made perfect sense once she explained it. Delilah had observed that while most of their quarter section was suffering from the drought, there was a low-lying area near the creek that remained relatively green because groundwater was closer to the surface there. She suggested concentrating their entire herd in that small area, which would normally be far too little space for so many cattle, but might be sufficient to keep them alive until rains returned. They would have to provide supplemental feed by purchasing hay from areas that had received more rain, an expensive proposition, but cheaper than losing their entire herd. Additionally, Delilah had noticed that several neighbors were selling their cattle at desperate prices. She proposed that instead of selling their own herd, they should actually purchase some of those cattle at rock-bottom prices, gambling that they could keep them alive until the drought broke and prices recovered. It was a risky strategy that required faith in her observations and a willingness to invest their savings on an uncertain outcome. Warren trusted his wife completely, so he followed her advice. They concentrated their herd in the green area near the creek and purchased hay from a farmer in Iowa who had experienced a wet year. Warren also bought 30 head of cattle from desperate neighbors at a fraction of their normal value, using most of their savings for the purchase and the feed required to sustain them. For months, they lived with anxiety gnawing at them constantly, wondering if the gamble would pay off or if they would lose everything. The rains finally returned in September, later than usual but heavy and sustained. The prairie greened up almost overnight, and the cattle rapidly regained their lost weight. By October, when buyers came through purchasing cattle for eastern markets, Warren's herd was in excellent condition, while many other ranchers had few or no cattle to sell. The prices had also recovered significantly since spring, and Warren commanded premium rates for his well-conditioned stock. The profit from that year's sale was substantial, multiplying their savings several times over and establishing them as one of the more prosperous ranching families in the area. Warren made sure everyone knew that the success was due entirely to Delilah's careful observation and thoughtful strategy. Her reputation grew even more, and people began to speak of her with genuine respect rather than the patronizing tolerance they had shown earlier. Perhaps the most satisfying moment came at church one Sunday when Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had mocked Delilah at the town well all those years ago, approached them after services. She asked if Delilah might be willing to look at Henderson's property, as they were having difficulty with their chickens not laying properly. Mrs. Henderson's tone was genuinely respectful and hopeful, completely lacking the condescension that had characterized her earlier interactions with Delilah. Delilah agreed after taking her usual time to consider, and she later visited the Henderson property. She observed that their chicken coop had been built with the roosts facing west, meaning the chickens roosted looking directly into the bright afternoon sun, which disrupted their laying cycles. She recommended simply turning the roosts to face east, a minor change that cost nothing and quickly resolved the problem. Mrs. Henderson was effusively grateful and became one of Delilah's most vocal supporters in town afterward. As the years continued to pass, Warren and Delilah's ranch became a model of success, and their partnership an example that other couples looked to. They added a fourth child in 1887, a daughter named Sarah Rose Nichols, completing their family. The children grew up understanding that their mother's slow speech was simply how she communicated, and that her words always carried wisdom worth waiting for. They learned patience and careful observation from her example, while absorbing their father's energy and enthusiasm for hard work. Thomas grew into a serious and capable young man who demonstrated his mother's thoughtful nature and his father's work ethic. He could outwork most men twice his age by the time he was 15, and his observations about ranch operations were consistently valuable. Grace developed her mother's patience and eye for detail, becoming an skilled seamstress and gardener who could coax beauty from even the most unpromising materials. Daniel had his father's quick smile and easy nature, making friends wherever he went and displaying a natural gift for working with horses. Sarah, the youngest, was still a child but already showing signs of combining her parents' best qualities in unique ways. In 1890, Warren used their accumulated profits to purchase an additional quarter section adjacent to their original property, doubling the size of their ranch. They now ran a herd of over 200 cattle and had established a breeding program that was producing some of the finest stock in Nebraska. Warren also began raising horses, focusing on sturdy working animals rather than fancy show horses, and found ready markets among farmers and ranchers throughout the region. The physical changes to their property over 15 years were remarkable. The original sod house had been expanded and improved, until it was a comfortable multi-room home with wood floors and plastered walls. The barn was substantial and well-maintained, capable of housing livestock during harsh winter storms. The garden had grown into nearly an acre of productive space, surrounded by a sturdy fence that kept out deer and rabbits. Trees that Warren had planted in those early years now provided shade and windbreak, their branches home to birds whose songs filled the morning air. More important than the physical prosperity was the emotional richness of their life together. Warren still looked at Delilah with love and admiration in his eyes, still gave her all the time she needed to speak, still valued her observations above all others. Delilah had blossomed under his patient affection, becoming more confident and willing to share her thoughts not just with Warren but with their community. She no longer hunched her shoulders defensively when speaking in public, no longer apologized for taking time to form her words, no longer doubted her own intelligence and worth. Their children adored both parents and learned from their example what a strong marriage looked like. They saw their father treating their mother with consistent respect and affection, never dismissing her or speaking over her or treating her as less than his full equal. They saw their mother managing complex household and ranch operations with quiet efficiency, her slow speech belying the quick intelligence that guided her decisions. They understood that different ways of communicating did not indicate different levels of capability or worth. In the fall of 1892, a traveling journalist from Omaha visited the area researching successful agricultural operations for a series of articles he was writing. He heard about the Nichols Ranch and requested an interview, which Warren and Delilah granted after some discussion. The journalist spent a full day at their property, observing their operations and asking detailed questions about their methods and philosophy. When the article was published several weeks later, the journalist devoted significant space to discussing Delilah's role in the ranch's success. He wrote about her careful observation and thoughtful decision-making, about how she had guided crucial choices that had prevented disasters and capitalized on opportunities. But most significantly, he wrote about how she had overcome the prejudice of people who confused slow speech with slow thinking, and how her husband had been wise enough to listen carefully to words that others dismissed. The article brought attention from beyond their immediate community, and several other ranchers from across Nebraska made trips to visit the Nichols operation and learn from their methods. Warren always made sure these visitors understood that Delilah was the true genius behind many of their most successful strategies. He would stand beside her while she slowly and carefully explained her observations and reasoning, his hand resting proudly on her shoulder, his love and respect for her evident in every gesture. As the 19th century drew to a close, Warren found himself reflecting frequently on the journey that had brought them to this point. He thought about that day in the mercantile store in 1875, 17 years earlier, when he had first seen Delilah struggling to communicate while others snickered. He thought about his younger self, the cowboy who had been wise enough or perhaps simply kind enough to actually listen to her instead of dismissing her. That simple choice to listen carefully had changed his entire life trajectory. It had led him to the love of his life, to a partnership that had made him more successful than he ever could have been alone, to a family that filled his days with joy and purpose. All because he had taken the time to truly hear wisdom that others missed in their rush to judgment. Delilah sometimes spoke about those early days as well, her words coming slowly but weighted with emotion. She told Warren that she had nearly given up hope of ever being truly seen and understood before he came along. The townspeople had treated her as simple, as less than, as someone to be pitied or mocked, and she had begun to believe their assessment of her worth. Meeting Warren had changed everything, giving her not just love but the confidence to believe in herself and her own capabilities. The new century arrived in 1900 with celebration and optimism throughout Nebraska City and across the nation. Warren and Delilah celebrated quietly at home with their children, now ranging in age from Sarah at 13 to Thomas at nearly 23. They toasted the new century with apple cider and talked about their hopes for what the coming years would bring. Thomas was courting a young woman from town, a schoolteacher named Emily who was patient and kind, and who treated Delilah with genuine respect. The courtship was serious, and Warren suspected a wedding would be announced within the year. Grace had received several offers of courtship, but had not yet found anyone who interested her particularly, much to her parents' relief as they were not ready to see her married and gone. Daniel and Sarah were still young enough that such matters were years away. The ranch continued to prosper, and Warren began to gradually transfer more of the daily operations to Thomas, teaching his son everything he knew about managing cattle and land. Thomas learned not just from his father but from his mother as well, absorbing her patient observation methods and thoughtful decision-making processes. It pleased Warren immensely to see how naturally Thomas turned to his mother for advice on complex questions, never showing impatience with her slow speech, clearly valuing her wisdom. In 1902, Thomas married Emily in a ceremony at the Nebraska City church, the same church where Warren and Delilah had spoken their own vows 27 years earlier. It was a joyous occasion attended by what seemed like the entire community, a testament to how much respect the Nichols family had earned over the decades. Delilah cried happy tears through the entire ceremony, and Warren held her hand tightly, both of them amazed at how quickly time had passed and how their baby boy had become a man. Thomas and Emily built a house on the far corner of the ranch property, establishing their own household while remaining close enough to help with the family operation. The arrangement worked well, and within a year, they announced that Delilah and Warren would become grandparents. The baby arrived in the summer of 1903, a healthy boy they named Warren Thomas Nichols, carrying on the family names into a new generation. Holding his grandson for the first time, Warren felt emotions wash over him that he could barely articulate. This tiny child represented the future, the continuation of everything he and Delilah had built together through decades of hard work and partnership. He looked across at his wife, now in her 50th year, her hair showing silver streaks and her face marked with lines earned through years of laughter and concern and careful thought. She had never looked more beautiful to him. The years continued their steady march forward, bringing changes both subtle and significant. Grace eventually married a banker from Omaha in 1905, moving to the city, but remaining close to her family through regular visits and correspondence. Daniel stayed on the ranch, partnering with Thomas in running the operation as Warren gradually stepped back from the heavy labor. Sarah, the youngest, showed no interest in marriage but instead threw herself into agricultural studies, reading everything she could find about soil science and crop rotation and animal husbandry. Warren and Delilah found themselves with more leisure time than they had experienced since those early desperate years of building the ranch. They would take long walks across their property in the evenings, Warren's hand holding Delilah's, comfortable in the silence that required no filling. Sometimes Delilah would share an observation about what she had noticed, her words coming as slowly as ever but now received by Warren as the precious gifts they were. One evening in the summer of 1908, As they sat together on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Warren turned to his wife of 33 years. He told her that he had been thinking about their life together, about how it had all started because he had been willing to listen carefully when everyone else dismissed her. Delilah squeezed his hand and slowly, carefully told him that it was not merely that he had listened, but that he had heard. He had understood that her slow speech did not reflect slow thinking, but rather reflected the careful consideration she gave to her words. Warren acknowledged this distinction and told her that learning to truly hear her had taught him to listen better to everything and everyone around him. Her example had made him more patient, more observant, more willing to consider before acting. She had made him a better man in every possible way, and he was grateful every single day for the gift of her presence in his life. Delilah's eyes filled with tears, as they sometimes still did when emotions ran high, and she told him that he had given her something even more precious. He had given her the confidence to believe in herself, to trust her own observations and judgments, to understand that she was not simple or less than but rather someone with valuable contributions to make. He had seen her when she was invisible to everyone else, and that had changed everything. They sat together as the light faded, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Two people who had built something remarkable not through individual brilliance, but through genuine partnership. The ranch around them stood as testament to what could be achieved when someone took the time to listen carefully, when wisdom was recognized regardless of how slowly it was spoken, when love was based on true seeing and understanding. More grandchildren arrived over the following years as their children's families grew. Thomas and Emily had 3 children by 1910, giving Warren and Delilah ample opportunity to be doting grandparents. Grace and her husband produced 2 children who were being raised in Omaha but visited the ranch regularly. Even Daniel eventually married in 1911, wedding a rancher's daughter from the next county over, and they settled into a house on the property near Thomas and Emily. The ranch itself continued to adapt to changing times and technologies. They purchased some of the new agricultural equipment becoming available, though Warren and Delilah both maintained that no machine could replace careful observation and thoughtful decision-making. Sarah took charge of implementing new scientific approaches to their operations, combining modern knowledge with her mother's traditional wisdom to achieve even better results. In 1915, as war raged in Europe though America remained technically neutral, Warren and Delilah celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered for a party that filled their home with noise and laughter and love. Looking around at the family they had created, at the prosperity they had built, at the respect they had earned in their community, Warren felt a profound sense of gratitude and accomplishment. The party was wonderful, with food and music and stories told about the early days of the ranch when everything had been uncertain and difficult. But the moment Warren treasured most came late in the evening after most guests had departed. He and Delilah stood together in their bedroom, the house finally quiet, and they held each other close. No words were needed, though Delilah eventually spoke slowly and softly, telling him that she loved him more than she had ever imagined possible loving anyone. Warren responded by kissing her tenderly, and then more passionately, their physical desire for each other undimmed by 4 decades of marriage. They made love that night with the comfortable familiarity of long partnership combined with genuine passion, and afterward, they lay entwined together feeling blessed beyond measure. The remaining years of the 1910s brought challenges as America entered the Great War, and young men from across Nebraska enlisted or were drafted to serve. The Nichols family was fortunate that their sons were too old and their grandsons too young to be called, but they felt the impact nonetheless as neighbors' sons departed and sometimes did not return. They contributed what they could to the war effort, selling cattle to feed the troops and knitting socks and sweaters to keep soldiers warm. Through all the changes and challenges, Warren and Delilah remained each other's anchor and support. They faced difficulties together, with Delilah's careful consideration guiding major decisions, and Warren's energetic implementation making those decisions reality. Their partnership had only deepened over the decades, becoming something so fundamental to who they each were that neither could imagine existence without the other. In 1920, as the new decade dawned and America recovered from both war and influenza pandemic, Warren was 68 years old and Delilah was 67. They were grandparents many times over and great-grandparents once over, with Thomas and Emily's oldest daughter having produced a son the previous year. The ranch was prosperous and well managed, mostly by the younger generation now, though Warren and Delilah still contributed their wisdom and experience. They had slowed down considerably, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard physical labor, but their minds remained sharp and their love for each other as strong as ever. They spent their days in comfortable routine, Warren handling lighter tasks around the property, while Delilah managed the household with help from daughters-in-law and granddaughters. The evenings found them on their porch if weather permitted, sitting in the chairs Warren had built years earlier, watching the sunset over land they had worked and nurtured for 45 years. One particular evening in late summer, with the air cooling after a hot day and the crickets beginning their nightly chorus, Delilah turned to Warren with an observation that had taken her some time to formulate. She spoke slowly about how blessed their life together had been, how everything good in her world had flowed from that moment when he had chosen to listen carefully instead of dismissing her. She told him that she had never taken his patience and respect for granted, not for a single day, and she wanted him to know how profoundly grateful she was. Warren took her hand, his thumb rubbing gently across her knuckles, and told her that the gratitude ran both ways. She had taught him what true wisdom looked like, had shown him that the deepest insights often required time and careful consideration rather than quick response. She had made him successful beyond his dreams, had given him children and grandchildren who carried forward the best of both their qualities, had filled his life with meaning and purpose and love. They sat together as darkness fell completely and the stars emerged in brilliant profusion across the clear Nebraska sky. The land stretched out around them, productive and beautiful, shaped by their decades of labor, but also by their partnership and mutual respect. The house behind them held generations of family who would continue their legacy long after they were gone. And between them flowed a love that had sustained them through every challenge and enriched every joy. In the years that followed, Warren and Delilah continued to age but remained engaged with life and family. They attended church regularly when health permitted and welcomed a steady stream of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren to their home. The community of Nebraska City had long since forgotten that anyone ever considered Delilah simple, remembering her instead as one of the wisest people who had ever lived among them. Stories were told and retold about her observations that had saved ranches and farms, about her careful decisions that had guided the Nichols operation through droughts and depressions and disasters. People spoke with respect about how Warren had been wise enough to recognize his wife's intelligence despite her slow speech, how their partnership had been a model of what marriage could be when built on genuine mutual regard. In 1925, Warren and Delilah celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary with a gathering even larger than their 40th. The entire community seemed to turn out, people coming from across Nebraska and even from other states to honor the couple who had become legendary in the region. Speeches were made praising their partnership and their contributions to agriculture and community. Gifts were presented, including a beautiful engraved clock and a quilt made by the ladies of the church incorporating squares from every family in the county. But again, the moment that mattered most to Warren and Delilah came after everyone had left and they were alone together. They climbed into bed that night exhausted but happy, and Warren pulled Delilah close against him as he had done thousands of times over 50 years. She nestled into his shoulder, her body fitting perfectly against his despite the changes time had wrought on both of them. And she told him slowly and with absolute certainty that she would choose him again in every lifetime. Warren felt tears prick his eyes at her words, and he responded that listening to her had been the best decision he had ever made and falling in love with her, the greatest blessing of his life. They drifted off to sleep holding each other, secure in the love that had sustained them for 5 decades and would carry them through however many years remained. Those remaining years proved to be fewer than they might have hoped. Warren's health began to decline in 1927, his heart growing weaker and his energy fading. He remained mentally sharp and emotionally engaged, but his body was finally giving out after 75 years of hard use. Delilah nursed him through various episodes and setbacks, her careful observation now focused entirely on monitoring his condition and ensuring his comfort. In the spring of 1928, Warren suffered a significant heart episode that left him bedridden. The family gathered, understanding that the end was approaching. For 2 weeks, Warren held on, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who came to say their goodbyes and express their love. But the person who never left his side was Delilah, holding his hand and speaking to him slowly and softly about all their years together, about the life they had built, about the love that would transcend even death. On a warm May morning with sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows, Warren passed away peacefully with Delilah holding his hand. His last words, spoken in barely a whisper, were to tell her that listening to her had made his life complete. Delilah bent close and told him slowly that loving him had been her greatest joy, and then he was gone, his hand going slack in hers, his breathing simply stopping as he slipped away. The grief Delilah felt was profound and overwhelming. For 53 years, Warren had been her constant companion, her supporter, her greatest advocate, and her deepest love. The world without him felt impossibly empty and cold. But she was sustained by her children and grandchildren who rallied around her, by the memories of a life extraordinarily well lived together, and by the knowledge that their love story had been something rare and precious. Warren was buried in the cemetery at Nebraska City, a simple stone marking his grave. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched over his 76 years. The eulogy spoke about his success as a rancher, but focused more on his character, on his kindness and integrity, on the way he had seen worth in someone others dismissed, and had built a legendary partnership as a result. Delilah lived for another 7 years after Warren's death, years that were difficult but not without meaning. She remained on the ranch in a small cottage that Daniel and his wife had built for her, close to family but maintaining her independence. She spent her days with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on the stories of the early years and the wisdom she had accumulated over a long life. Her speech remained slow until the very end, but by this time, Multiple generations had learned to wait patiently for words they knew would be worth hearing. In the autumn of 1935, Delilah Anne Nichols passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 82. She was laid to rest beside Warren, their graves side by side as they had been side by side in life. The stone marking her grave identified her as a beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother, but more importantly, it carried an inscription that Warren had requested before his death. She spoke slowly but with wisdom. He listened carefully and heard truth. The ranch they had built together continued to thrive under the management of their descendants. The land they had nurtured for half a century, producing abundance for generations to come. The methods Delilah had developed through careful observation became standard practice, passed down from parent to child along with stories about the woman who saw what others missed, because she took the time to truly look and consider before speaking. In Nebraska City and the surrounding region, the story of Warren and Delilah became something of a legend, told and retold as an example of what love could look like when it was based on genuine respect and true seeing. People spoke about how the cowboy had listened carefully to the woman others dismissed, and had discovered wisdom that made both their lives richer. They talked about how judgment based on superficial characteristics could blind people to profound worth, and how patience and careful attention could reveal treasures others rushed past without noticing. The lesson of their love story endured. That wisdom speaks in many ways and at many speeds, that true intelligence is not measured by how quickly someone speaks but by the depth of their observations, and that the greatest partnerships are built not on superficial attraction but on profound respect for each other's minds and hearts. Warren and Delilah had proven these truths through a lifetime of partnership, and their example continued to inspire long after both had passed from the world. Their descendants carried forward the best of what they had taught, combining careful observation with energetic action, listening patiently before responding, recognizing that different ways of thinking and communicating could complement each other beautifully. The ranch they had established from nothing but land and labor and love became a lasting monument to what could be achieved when two people truly saw each other and worked together in genuine partnership. And on quiet evenings when the sun set over the Nebraska prairie, painting the sky in brilliant colors, people would sometimes think of Warren and Delilah sitting on their porch together, hands intertwined, comfortable in silence or engaged in slow conversation. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and had built something beautiful that would last far beyond their own lifetimes. The townspeople had called her simple for speaking slow, but a cowboy had listened carefully and heard wisdom, and that single choice had created a love story for the ages.